What is the date today?
I believe this is January the 17th, is it not?
Okay. Yes, January 17th, 1983.
Mm-hmm.
And this is Joe Todd, interview with Helen Marie Barnhart. Okay. Mrs. Barnhart, when were you born?
March 13, 1910, at Cable, Ohio, while Alice Cammett was going over.
What's the name of the town?
Cable, C-A-B-L-E.
C-A-B-L-E.
Very small town.
Okay. Who was your father?
Clark Wilson Davis.
Was he from Ohio?
He was, yes, he was, in fact, he was born in the same county I was, Champaign County. His folks were originally from England, where the prince has his domain. The Welsh, is it? Wales, that's it. He was originally from Wales, or his folks were. But they settled in Ohio, and I believe that most of the family on my father's side lived there.
And who was your mother?
Helen May Martins, Martens.
Was she from Ohio also?
No, she was born in Germany, and they were living in Frankfurt, I believe, when they decided to come to America.
How old was your mother when they came to America?
14, and she brought a little 12-year-old brother with her, just the two of them, which today you would think of them as children, but back then they were adults. She could sew all the garments of her family and things like that, and do all the cooking and all.
Did she tell you about the trip coming over?
Yes, she did. It was very difficult because my mother was one of these spotless, clean persons, and to live in such filth with rats and mice and all kinds of bugs in the food, and they had one little bed to share between them, and they had to keep their clothes on and no way of bathing. It was really very, very hard on them.
How long did the trip take?
They went steerage, I believe it's called, and I believe she said it must have been around 6 weeks. They ran into difficulties and storms and so forth. But she said that she wanted to run out and kiss the ground when she saw the Statue of Liberty, because she loved America before she ever came here. She wanted to leave Germany so very much. They had to bow on the street to the Kaiser, and she said she was not going to bow to any man. And that's why she talked her parents into coming to America. Mm-hmm. And she was so happy here. She loved America, I guess, more than any other human being I've ever met.
When did she come to the U.S.?
That was in, let's see, I was born in 1910. I believe it must have been around 1902 or 4, somewhere around in that area.
Did she talk about Ellis Island coming through?
Yes, she did. They had to make them understand that they had someone here in America that would vouch for them, that they would not be on relief or have someone else take care of them. And she had $1 left in her purse when she and her little brother Willie stepped off of from Ellis Island. And she said, now we have our train fare all paid for to Holiday, North Dakota. And she said, I'm sure this $1 will see us all the way there. She went in a bakery shop and she said, we'll buy enough bread, maybe 8 or 10 loaves with this $1, and then that'll carry us. But the man gave her one small loaf and told her that it took the entire $1. And she thought, well, that was pretty severe if she was going to have to pay those high prices here in America, which the loaf of bread was only a nickel. So that was her first brush with dishonesty. but she said that it didn't deter her desire to live here. And so when they got on the train, why they threw a loaf of bread, and they were fairly hungry. And she said to her brother Willie, she says, "I do not know how to speak English, but," she said, "I'll find a way to get us to Holiday without starving to death." So she went up and down the train, and she said, "Kann ich der Deutsch sprechen," and finally she found a man that spoke both English and German, and she said, "Will you come with me and tell all the people on the train that I am here to serve them? If they will just give us food, we don't want any money. We just want enough food for my little brother and I, and I'll do anything. I'll take care of their children. I'll wash their clothes. I'll do anything that they want me to." So she made it all the way to Holiday, and they were well fed, and that was the way she started her marriage. She never asked for anything but what she always gave something for it. And that's the way I have lived my life. I never have asked a penny from anyone. I always try to pay my own way.
When did your mother move from North Dakota to Ohio?
Well, then she got a job in the Army, cooking in Miles City, Montana. And that was where she met my father. He was captain. He had been in the Spanish-American War, and he was captain in the Army there. And he met her in the kitchen, and though she couldn't speak English, he knew that he wanted to know her better and marry her. He said he knew already that he wanted her for his wife, because she was that kind of person. She was beautiful too. And so then he had to get someone that could speak German to go in and tell her that he had already fallen in love with her and he wanted her for his wife, and said, "If you'll teach me German, I'll teach you English." So every night they would meet at the table in the kitchen, and that's how each one learned the other's language. And when she finally knew enough American or English, well, then they were married. And then she had her first child, Dorothy Adele Buneman, in Miles City, Montana. And from there, they did not have money to go across country, but they wanted to go back to Ohio. So they got on boxcars. They sat in boxcars and had their lunch with them, and with this one little baby, until they got to Ohio. Now, people today would never, ever be able to do what they did back in those days and live through it, because and still keep your dignity and and keep your character without unblemished, because my parents were very, very moral people. And then my father went in the ministry. He went to the Moody Institute and received his degree, and then joined the Presbyterian Church. And then they went back to North Dakota and started from one end of it to the other, right across that main highway. It completely crosses North Dakota. And he built churches in Dawson, Tuttle, Killdeer, Minot, Dunn Center, Jamestown. It opened Presbyterian churches all the way, and they would send in a minister, and he'd go to the next town, build another church, get it started and going good, go to the next one. And I think it was in Dawson they wanted to make him mayor. And that was quite a bad thing to do, to get in politics, because we were almost all killed, the whole family. Someone came in our house while we were at church and poisoned all our food, the flour and sugar and everything. He put poison in it. And if my mother had not been the spotless housekeeper she was, when she came in the house, she noticed a little fleck of cigar ashes on the floor. She knew my father did not smoke. And she said, "Daddy, someone has been in this house while we were away." And back then we didn't even lock doors or windows, because everybody was just very good people. And So he said, well, don't touch a thing in this house till I have it analyzed. And he had it analyzed. And then he let it be known through the newspapers that he was dropping out and he would not run for mayor. And that was the last time he ever tried for a political office.
Any idea who did it?
No, we didn't even want to know.
That was in Dawes?
Dawson.
Dawson.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And this is what's happened. But we had wonderful life. I'll say that I had one of the happiest childhood that any child could have. And if I had to go back and be a child again, I would want identically the same childhood I had.
Can you tell me about your childhood in Ohio?
Well, in Ohio, I don't recall it because I was born 3 months too soon. I was a 7-month baby. My mother and daddy were on their way back to North Dakota with Dorothy and George. They were the 2 older children. And she was expecting me, but she expected to be in North Dakota when I was born. But she stopped at Mrs. Hess's house in Cable, and she had gone downstairs in one of those little fruit cellars where the steps are about like that. And she tumbled over and over and over down the steps. And so then they put her to bed, and I was born at 8 o'clock Sunday morning on the 13th. And she had to stay there until I was able to travel. And then they went to North Dakota. But so that's all I know about Ohio, except that I've had a sister that lived there many, many years in Massillon. And also we went back for one visit to Columbus, Ohio, and Cleveland also.
Were you raised in North Dakota then?
I was raised in North Dakota till I was 10 or 11.
What town were you raised in?
Well, all of these little towns. See, my father just went from one to the other.
Was he a circuit rider?
No. Well, you'd have to say he was an itinerant preacher. You know, just a traveler going. But he belonged to the Presbyterian Church. They were paying him.
Yeah. Okay.
He was in the Presbytery. And that's what they wanted him to do because they knew he was the type of person that could go in a town and in 5 minutes everybody knew him. I mean, everybody just loved him right from the beginning. And he had a very, very wonderful personality.
Can you tell me something about your childhood in North Dakota then? Some of the things that you remember.
Well, I remember taking the milk always to different people in the town. My mother always ran a dairy. No matter where we went, we had to supplement, with a large family.
How did you run a dairy when you were on the road?
Well, she would always buy a certain number of cows when we got to the town. And then she would furnish all the milk, butter, cheese, and everything like that. And I was the one that had to take it to everybody's house before I went to school. And then in my little wagon. And then on Saturdays I would collect. And this was a very good experience for me. It taught me how to handle money and so forth. And I enjoyed that. That was fun. You see, children today would think of it as work. Back then, it was fun to do it because we realized that life was work. In other words, it wasn't something you just didn't come into the world for someone else to take care of you. We had to take care of ourselves. We had to learn how as a child. But school was wonderful. That little one-room schoolhouse, all the eighth grades were in it.
Where was this?
That was in each town as I went from town to town. And it did not hold us back. You would think that moving so much and being in a school one year and then the next year in another school, that it would hold you back. But it did not. With us, we only learned that much more by traveling. And of course, our father instructed us at home and would not let us get away with anything, that we had to come home and do our work, and study. But if we brought a bad grade home, we knew that we were in for it. So we loved school, and the teachers were wonderful to us.
What were the name of some of the towns and the schools and the teachers that?
Now the teachers, the first teacher's name that I can remember was Mrs. Powell, And that was when we left North Dakota and we went to North Carolina. Then I lived in North Carolina. We moved from North Dakota to Star, North Carolina. And I was about 11 or 12 then. And then my first teacher, whose name I remember, was Mrs. Powell. And the reason I remember her was that she had asked each child to bring a poem the next day that they had made up themselves. Now this was where I got my first, see, I do the Bible study here. And one thing that I instruct each one of them is always to speak very honestly, truthfully, to always be truthful. And I've stressed it until they, I guess some of them resent it. But we had to, back as a child, if we were ever found we didn't tell the truth, we really got it. I mean, we didn't do it again. And the first, that was the first thing that I had done that really made me think. I went home and, I always had to be the best in the class. If my grade wasn't the highest, if I wasn't the highest in the class, I would be miserable inside. I wanted to always strive for the very top. Now, maybe this is wrong, but yet it's a drive I think that you're born with, because all my sisters and brothers didn't have it. They didn't care whether they had their lesson or not, but I did. So I wanted the best poem that when they get up the next day to recite. And I could not write a poem, and I was crying. And my father came in, he said, "Honey, what's wrong?" I said, "Daddy, I have to have a poem for tomorrow, and I cannot think of anything to say." I didn't know how to. Today I write poems every day. I mean, they come easy to me, but back then I could not. And he said, "Well, let's see, what kind of poem do you want?" Now, he didn't know that he was a poet. He had never, from that up to that day, had never written a poem, and when he died, he was known as the St. Louis poet. And he wrote every day for their newspapers, his poems, and I'll show you some of them. And but then he didn't know it. But I was the one that showed him that he could write poetry, and he showed me that I had to be honest and truthful. And I've told this to many of my classes because I want them to show them that you can't get away with an untruth. So he said, "Well, how about this? Once there was a little brown bug, and it crawled to the top of a little brown jug. And when it got to the top, its foot did slip, and down it fell with a dip. And the jug was filled half full of sand. And so the little bug discovered a new land." Well, that's a little simple poem. But I got up the next day and I recited it, with all the gestures and everything. Well, the teacher just thought it was marvelous. She said, "Helen, you really have it." And I took the credit for it. I stood there and took all the honors, and then everybody was calling me the poet of the school, but I was beginning to feel miserable inside. And so I studied for about a month, and finally I couldn't take it any longer. I said, "I don't care if I get beaten for it, I'm going to tell the truth." I went to Miss Powell and I told her that I did not make it up, that my father did. And do you know that she showed me more respect and more liking? She liked me better, I think, as a student after that than ever before. So that shows that if you stand up to your mistakes, the things you do wrong, if you admit them and stand up to, that people will respect you more than if you hide behind. So, but from that time on, my father started writing poetry, and they were beautiful poems. I mean, they're just, I don't see today how they have not made him famous through his poetry, because I've never read more beautiful poems.
Do you have
Yes,
a lot of the
I
poems
have.
that he's written?
Yes, I have. It's the prodigal girl, King of Kings, and he wrote, "Don't you believe in Santa Claus? What would I do tomorrow if a million were mine today?" He's just written one after the other. I'd have to sit down and list them all. There's so many. But anyway, to get back to the story, this taught me that one lesson, and then the other lesson I was taught in honesty. And you know, honesty and truthfulness come together. I can truthfully say here before God that the only thing I ever took in my life that wasn't mine was 10 cents from my mother. And that was where I learned it. I was getting the money. You know, I had to go every Saturday and collect the money. And I had my little purse just full of those dimes and quarters and nickels and all. And I passed the store where they have candy in the window. My sister was with me. And we looked at that chocolate candy, and we'd walk a few steps and come back and look at it. See, we only had candy twice a year. We didn't have candy every day. On Christmas and on our birthday, we were given a bag of candy. So Dorothy said, "Well, we could buy it." And I said, "Well, how?" Now, I went along with her. She might have put the idea in my mind, but I was willing to go along with her. So I was just as guilty. And she said we could take a dime from the purse and buy the candy and then tell Mama we lost it. And I thought a while on that, and I thought, well, that candy looks awfully good. So I did it. I went in, took about a dime's worth of candy. And we got out and we started eating it. I noticed it didn't taste good like it always did. It just did not taste good. It tasted like gravel in my mouth. Now, you can believe this or not, but that candy did not taste good. And before, we just loved it. Well, we buried it on the side of a little fence post going home and put dirt over it. And so when I got home, I told Mama that I lost the dime. Well, she said, "That was very careless, honey, but try to be more careful next time." But when I started to eat supper, that food would not go down. It just stayed right here in my throat, big lump there. And finally, I left the table, and Mother thought, well, I was ill because we were all good eaters. She was a marvelous cook. And then after I went to bed, I couldn't sleep, and I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about that because, you know, we had family altar. Every morning and every evening, we had to all come together, kneel on our chairs, say our prayer, and then we always felt good afterwards, and we could talk to the Lord. So I was taught, you know, that you just would not go to heaven if you took anything that wasn't yours. And see, children aren't taught this today. It was instilled in me that if I took something that was not mine, that I couldn't ever see God. God wouldn't even look at me. And I was just thinking how bad, terrible it was that I couldn't see God. And I began to cry, and Mother came in, and she said, "You want to tell me about it?" And so I told her what I did. And I said, "Mama, you'll never trust me again. Never. And you told me once that you trusted me with anything. And you'll never trust me again." And if I hadn't had the most wonderful mother in the world, she said, "Honey, but now I'll trust you more than ever." Now, how many mothers would say that to their child after they had done something? That saying I said was what made me then. That kind of mother. Now I'll trust you more than ever. And do you think that from that day on I could have ever taken anything that wasn't mine? No, sir. I always say that when I die, I don't want to have one thing in my possession that belongs to someone else. Anyone, they can leave all their doors open here in this building, and there's things that would be just as safe around me as if, well, in the safest, in a vault, because I would not walk through their door or touch anything that was there. And I wish that the world was like that today.
It'd be nice.
It would be. We wouldn't be living in this terrible. I know that people are having it rough, but I've had it rough, and it didn't make me want to do something bad. I went through the Depression with 4 little children, and
If I could regress just a little bit, back in North Dakota, how did you travel from town to town?
we had a buggy or a wagon. And just before we left North Dakota, I think my father got an old tin lizzie. That's what we called them, or a flivver. That was another name for it. And it didn't have windows in it. It had the little curtains that you buttoned onto the. And we'd go. Well, we did. Now we did try homesteading. I'll have to tell you that. Everybody else was homesteading and getting rich because they got 200 acres, and if they could show improvement on it in a certain length of time, it became theirs. The government would give them a deed to it. So Daddy went out and staked off 200 acres and put my mother in. I think there were 3 of us then. I think I was the baby, and put us out on the homestead. And then some terrible, terrible things happened to my mother that almost cost her life. And my father said, I can't do both. I can't homestead and preach, because he was always away and leaving her there alone on the homestead. And we'd come home and find some terrible catastrophe, because she was only a woman. She couldn't do all the things that a man could do. And he said, I was called into the ministry to preach, and he said, are you willing to just be a poor preacher's wife? And Mother said, whatever you do is all right with me. So we had to give up the homestead. But everybody else that had their homesteads, they really, a lot of my relatives are really wealthy today.
What kind of homes did you live in while you were traveling?
Well, they were wooden frame houses, even up in North Dakota where it got 20 below. We had those little wooden houses, and it was all heated by a stove, a big stove where you put coal or wood in, and we'd have to always have it carried to the house. We children had to do that. If there was wood trees on the house, on the place, we had to cut them up and bring them in for Mother. But to us, that was fun. It wasn't a hardship like children would think today. I wouldn't have traded my childhood for the childhood today, where they have TVs and radio and all. Not one iota. We'd get out and play baseball on the corner lot, or we'd do fun things.
Now, was there a house in each town that you went to that you lived in?
Yes, usually the manse was right next to the church. See, and we live in the manse, and it was fairly comfortable. I'll say that for the Presbyterian Church. They always looked out for their preachers.
What were the towns that you went to?
Well,
in North Dakota.
I think the first town was Minot, and then was Killdeer, and Dunn Center, and Tuttle, Dawson, Jamestown, and even Bismarck. They were all on that line right across the state, just one after the other.
Was that on the railroad?
Well, no, it was it was a highway, but I don't believe it was paved back then. It was just a dirt road. But now, of course, it's a nice paved highway.
What year was that?
That was about 1904 or 5. Then, let's see, Taft was in president when I was born. And then came Wilson. And Wilson was the first president, I remember, because he was coming through town on the back of the train, and the school let out. And I was 7 years old then. That was around 1917 when the war started. And he was trying to get bonds, money. And so Mother said, now you go and stand alongside of the train so you can see President Wilson. And I had never seen a black person. Up till then, I had never laid eyes on a black person when I was 7 years old. Was the first time. And this porter came out first, and he was black. Well, I knew that was president because he was an unusual person. He was a big person, and I never even glanced at President Wilson. I couldn't take my eyes off of this black man, because to me, he was the president. He had to be. He was unusual. So I ran home and told my mother that President Wilson was black. And so I didn't get to see President Wilson, even though he was standing right there by him.
Mm-hmm.
See, a child, they make up their own mind, you know, what's important and what isn't important.
Mm-hmm.
But it was cute because then after that, I got to see one black man, or not black women, just black men, would come to the door, you know, and know if we had any work for them. And I'd take soap and water out and tell them that they could get that black off if they just wash real good. And yeah, we learned to love the black people. You know, that's something I can't understand, is one race disliking another, because all people are wonderful to me, I think. And so I don't want to take up any more of your time, but I have lived here now in Oklahoma since 39. And I came here from Barnhart, Missouri. We had a little town named for us, and they were taking all our money. I mean, because we had the town named for us, why, they felt that if they needed money, they could always come to us. And so my father-in-law owned the Barnhart Mercantile Company, which was $1 million organization, and all that money is gone. My children, they did not inherit one thing. And even that big estate, 200 acres up on Barnhart Hill. And now you go in St. Louis and you see the same sign Barnhart all the way through St. Louis, where to go to Barnhart. And it's a great big town now with many, many. My father-in-law owned the Barnhart Mercantile Company, which was $1 million organization, and all that money is gone. My children, they did not inherit one thing. And even that big estate, 200 acres up on Barnhart Hill. And now you go in St. Louis and you see the same sign Barnhart all the way through St. Louis, where to go to Barnhart. And it's a great big town now with many, many.
Now, who was Barnhart named after?
That was named after my father-in-law, Carrie Lee Barnhart, but it was given to my husband, Francis Lee Barnhart, at his death. So he inherited the town of Barnhart, and that's where my children were. All my children were born.
Now, where'd you meet your husband?
My father had the church in Barnhart, and I was about 16 then, and I went home to visit him one Saturday, and he asked me if I would run to the store and get some groceries for them, since I was already dressed and all to go. So I went over to the big country store that was on the corner, and as I was standing in there, the front door of the store opened, and Mr. Barnhart was standing there. Well, he was about 18 years older than I was, and he had been a bachelor many, many years. He had been married before, but he lost his wife the first year they were married, giving birth to a 10-pound baby. So he had never then wanted to get married again. He was always afraid that he'd lose, he couldn't get over it, that she had lost her life because of giving birth to his child. So he didn't want to ever remarry. But we just took one look at each other, and that was it. I just thought he was the most marvelous person I'd ever met.
Now, when did you move to Missouri from North Carolina?
North Carolina, let's see. That was we were in Star for about 3 years, and then we went to Southport. then we'd go up and down Cape Fear River to Wilmington. You know, Wilmington's right up there, Cape Fear River. And we lived there 2 years. And then because my mother had a sister living in St. Louis, and they hadn't seen each other many years, they decided to try their hand at a big city, because we'd always lived in little small towns. So then we came to St. Louis, and my aunt was living in a little 3-room house on Pestalozzi Street. And my mother and father came in with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 children, and my aunt had 6 children, and we all stayed in those 3 rooms, and yet it was so clean in there and so spotless. You could lay on the floor. They were both of those scrubby Dutch women, you know, that we had to always be spotlessly clean. There was no bathroom. The little outhouse was out in the cities, you know. They didn't have bathrooms then. They had underwater little ditches, you know, that ran, and then each one had their own little outhouse out in the city, right in the back of the little city lot. You can't believe that. That was back in 1924. Yeah, 1924. And that when I went to St. Louis, of course, that's all done away with now. Yeah. Everybody has a bathroom in St. Louis.
What was your first impression of St. Louis?
Dirty, filthy, you know, smokestacks and smoke and little old mean-looking houses, because I didn't see the better part of town. When you come into St. Louis, you see it's just like that. But now I know that it's just a great city.
Yeah. Did you come by train to St. Louis?
By train, and we went in, you know, the worst part of town. I don't know why buses and trains always bring you in right to what you might call like a ghetto. So that's your impression, your first impression. But then I lived in nice houses out in the south part of St. Louis. You could see the steps a mile away. They sparkled in the sun. They were so clean and pretty, and the streets were all washed, and the trees so pretty and all. But you see, that's a different side of St. Louis that you see. But what I saw was bad when I first came.
Did you come into the old train depot?
The old train depot in St. Louis.
What did you think of that building when you first saw it?
Well, of course, it's to a child that has never really lived around anything like that. It's kind of awesome, you know. It's strange. You feel like you're going to get lost. That you're just a little tiny speck of dust. In other words, you don't feel any awareness of yourself. It just seems like you're crowded in. And that's the way I felt when I went to the schools there too, in that area. You just feel, I didn't have the same feeling in the schoolroom. You had a packed school with just one grade in each room, you know, and the teacher didn't take a personal interest in you. You were just another student, was all. Mm-hmm. Then you lose that zeal that you have. And so I never did get it back again like I had it in the little one classroom.
When did you get married?
I was 1932, I believe it was.
What was your husband's name?
Francis Lee Barnhart.
And the town of Barnhart was named after your father-in-law.
After my father-in-law.
And you say the town was left to your father?
Yeah, my father-in-law owned the whole town and built little houses and let people rent them. And then when my husband took over during the Depression, and people were so depressed and all, they didn't have anything and nothing to eat, he gave them clear deeds to their home, where they didn't pay anymore. And of course, we started going downhill from there. Then he built a great big apartment house in St. Louis. and the renters just would pay their first month's rent, then go back a couple months, and then move out on you and that. And finally, we lost money on that. It was just one thing after another that we lost money until finally I realized that if we were going to be able to be an individual and be able to stand on our own feet, we were going to have to get in another part of the country, get away from Barnhart altogether.
Mm-hmm.
So
now, is Barnhart close to St. Louis?
Well, it's only about a 5-minute drive from the edge of St. Louis into Barnhart. Mm-hmm. We used to go in every day to St. Louis. It was.
Where did you lived in the town of Barnhart then?
Mm-hmm. Lived up on the hill. It was the Barnhart home was way up on the hill like that, and the town was right circled the hill.
Is the home still there?
Yes, today it's a show place. People go out to see it.
Who owns it now?
I think the Pasternaks bought it from us. One of the Pasternaks from Hollywood. They realized what a steal it was because they got it for just a song. And today it's worth, I guess, maybe $300,000-$400,000. $400,000.
And so you lost the estate in the Depression.
Mm-hmm. We lost everything. Mm-hmm. And I went to work then for Barnes Hospital, and I worked for them for, well, off and on, I guess, for many years.
What was your father-in-law's name?
Kerry Lee. He's in some of the history books in St. Louis for different things that he did for the city.
What was he like?
Wonderful person. He was very austere, very moral, as was my mother-in-law, Nancy. Now, Nancy Barnhart, I named my daughter Nancy after her. She, of course, they were related to the Randolphs and the Carters and that from Virginia, and they were proud they were aristocrats. And they were not very happy about my husband marrying outside of the aristocratic family. Not that they had anything against our family, but we were not aristocrats. We were not blue blood. And of course, this, I had to, well, they did love me afterwards. I mean, even my sister-in-law, right up to the day she died, she told me how much she loved me. But you had to really, really work to get them to love you, because if you were not blue blood, you were not much of anything. And they realized they were related to all these different ones in Virginia, like the Randolphs and the Carters and the Byrds. And I think Mr. Bird, the bird that with the North Pole.
Yeah.
Well, he sent my husband and I a beautiful wedding present. Gave us a china cabinet for our dining room. And now just think what that would be worth today if I had it. And that all went in the Depression. Havilon dishes, these beautiful.
Can you just give an overall description of the inside of the Barnhart home?
Well, when you first come into it had the coat of arms, of course. They have to have, all those blue bloods have the coat of arms. Well, that was on the window right alongside of the door. The fireplace was so large you could almost walk in it for the big logs. And then the box, they had a box alongside of the fireplace that you put the logs in from the outside so you wouldn't carry anything into the house. And there was one great big living area as you walked in. It was, in fact, it was as large as probably this room 4 times over. And then they had a large dining room, and they had all these beautiful chandeliers brought from California that were shells of beautiful, fish, and they had them fixed into light fixtures. And even next to the fireplace, you had beautiful shells with the pink, and the lights would show through And then they didn't. Blue Bloods do not believe in have the man and wife to have the same quarters. The man has one side of the house and the woman has the other, because they don't believe in that. You know, that you stay together. They're like they call it ordinary people that do. So my husband had a nice big bedroom and a library and den on one side of the house, and I had mine on the other, where I kept the children. See, the children were kept away from the husband. He didn't have to worry about crying children and that. And then all the cooking, the kitchen and laundry rooms and all were way back behind the dining room. And you had, and then this beautiful green lawn with a big winding roadway going up to it with little pine trees all around it, and all kinds of flowers. And the entire yard where the house was, I don't mean the property, but just the house, had pine trees just every so many feet, and they were about the old 25 to 30 feet tall. And that was circled the house, so you didn't see the house till you got right into the...
What kind of furnishings were in the house?
Well, that was all antique. Today, if we had all the antique furniture we had the day that my husband carried me over the threshold, I would say I'd be worth $1 million in just antiques alone. The cherry cabinets, the music boxes, great big music box with those big discs on. You put them on, and they play for hours. And the old-fashioned piano with the spindle legs, you know, and the just everything about even the chairs, Davenport and all, were that old antique, the kind that never wears out. You just, they were made, you know, they were made by very fine craftsmen, so and the paintings and all. And of course, the paintings were the first thing that went when we needed money. And
so was everything sold off from the house then, all the antiques?
Everything. I don't believe it. I'll tell you the only thing I got out of, there is a brick in that little thing, and I've carried it with me. That's the only thing I have left of my old home.
Mm-hmm. Must be sad to give up your home like that.
Yeah. Well, see, Governor O'Fallon lived in the original house where the new house was built. He was in the old, and so they lived in the old house for a long time before that was torn down, and then the new house was built on. So I have and then when I came here, who did I become acquainted with in Oklahoma City? But Mrs. Buttram and her brother, Mr. Newby. And so I just became part of their family, and I lived in their home a good deal of the time. And, you know, they lived very well. And
how'd you come to Oklahoma? Did you come by train?
I came first time by plane. I came by myself, and it looked so beautiful from this air. Oh, to look down, Oklahoma looks so clean, pretty and white in the sun, and there wasn't all these bustle and everything. I could drive right across Oklahoma in a half hour by car, just from one end of Oklahoma to the other. You could go leisurely in a half hour. And now, it takes you an hour to get even into Oklahoma.
Why did you come to Oklahoma City?
Well, I heard that Oklahoma City was a very beautiful, beautiful place to live. And then they have hospitals here. See, I always worked in hospitals or doctors. I worked for Dr. Nemeth out in California in Huntington Park for 10 years. I was his bookkeeper. So you see, I've always been
When did you go to California?
Oh, I went out there because my children were all in the service then, you know, my son-in-laws and all, and so my children were living out there. I wanted to be near them. Yeah. And so then when they left the service, they came back to Oklahoma, and I stayed because I had this position, and I didn't want to give it up. And so then I came back here in I've been in and out of Oklahoma City for, I guess, since 1939. We always come back.
Now, where did you first live when you moved to Oklahoma City?
Oh my goodness, let's see, where did I first live? I lived, I don't know all the streets. I believe I lived on 9th Street, and but I don't know the number. I lived on. I lived out on Shields and in Capitol Hill. I lived in Midwest City. Lived in Del City on Breckenridge, and.
Now, when did you meet the Buttrams?
Oh, let's see, that's been a good many years ago. You know, Miss Buttram died. Mrs. Newby died, and Mrs. Buttram, she died after. And then Mr. Newby's sister, you know, was a teacher here at this college here in Edmond. I think that when, I know this was in the newspaper, I'm not telling you anything that isn't known, but she did commit suicide, you know, and that just, I think, really destroyed the family. They just couldn't get over it.
Yeah.
Miss Buttram was just devastated.
And then you lived with the Buttrams for a while, you say?
And Frank Buttram, you know, was quite ill towards his last.
What was he like?
He was a nice person, but he, you know, when we get old, we get a little bit childish and that, but I think that he always knew what was going on, but he did need help towards the last few years. But he was a very fine. In fact, the whole family, I would say, were just wonderful people.
What was Mrs. Buttram like?
Well, listen, at 80-something, she looked like she was 40. Slender, always kept herself so trim-looking, you know, and was always into doing everything. And her son lived right across the street from the Newbys. Let's see, what is his name? As well as I know his name. Now that's when you know you're getting old, is when names start kind of receding in your memory.
What was the inside of the Buttram house like?
Well, it's a show place now, you know. You can go there and just go through it and see it.
It's the art museum now.
Yes, well, that's about the way it was then, except that it was probably a few changes. But
what kind of furniture did they have in the house?
Oh my, I couldn't tell you that. I'm not much up on anything like that. I couldn't even tell you. As long as I was with newbies, I couldn't tell you that. They just, you could tell that it was fine things. It was things that you would be proud of owning. But what I mean is, I couldn't tell you names or anything of it.
So you moved the whole family to Oklahoma City?
Yes, the whole family moved here, and my children all married Oklahomans, so I guess they're all Okies now. My son is out at the Cardinal Paper Company. He's, well, I don't know what you'd call his position, but I know he has built himself, has worked his way up to one of the top positions. And then my son-in-law, John Rye Gibbon, he was a teacher here. He graduated here, and now my little granddaughter is going to this college.
That's good.
And so we like Oklahoma. Oklahoma is home to us. I'm not at home anyplace else now. Oklahoma is my home. I lived in Florida and went down there. And in fact, I've only been back a year and a half from Florida. So I've lived all around, but this is home to me. I have cemetery lots paid for here on Sunny Lane, and I expect to be buried here.
What were you doing on Pearl Harbor Day, December 7th, 1941?
Pearl Harbor Day. I was living in Barnhart at the time, and I needed some wood for the stove. I had the radio going, and it was a warm day. This was strange. I only had a sweater on, and in December, 7th of December, it's cold in St. Louis. But this day was warm. I had a sweater on and had the window open to the kitchen, and the radio was going, and I was cutting wood when I heard it coming over the air that the United States had declared war on Japan. Well, I'll tell you what, that was then we opened our home to the soldiers because, see, they were coming in with their wives. They couldn't find places to live, so we just opened their home to. In fact, we had already moved out of our house and had moved over to the old Holt House place, which was about 24 rooms in that house. So we just let all those rooms out to soldier boys with their wives. It was really so terrible. My youngest child was, I think, about 2.
And so you did quite a bit of work for the war effort then.
Oh, yes. Oh, I went right to work for Small Arms, and so did my husband. In fact, he made a coolant for their machine and got a citation from the government and a $25 war bond for giving them the idea of how to cool their machine so they wouldn't have to shut them off. They always had to shut them off for hours to cool them. And he said, well, if you just do this, you wouldn't have to shut them off. And he showed them how. And so that's all he got out of it. But I know that the government, was able to make millions out of his invention. But we don't feel bad about it. I think that when you can do something to help your country, you should. Yeah. You shouldn't expect to be paid for that. This is your country.
And that was at Small Arms?
Small Arms.
That's in St. Louis? What'd you do for them?
I worked in the bullet place where the bullets passed, and you'd look at each bullet to see that they were perfect because they could kill a boy if the bullet was not just absolutely perfect.
So you were an inspector then?
I was an inspector. And then Simonton, who was later ran for president, he was the head of the fluorescent electric company at that time, and that was made over into a war material. And he wanted me to come over there and work for him, so I would sit on a big stool and read President Roosevelt's speeches over the air, and while the people were all working, they could hear his speeches. I love to speak, I have been taught to speak, and I guess I enjoy that more than anything else, is to give speeches.
You were taught elocution?
Oh, yes. Yes, I had my father made us learn music. We had to learn to play the piano. I play about 10 different instruments, and I play in the band here. We have a little band, that Alma is the head of it.
Were you living in St. Louis when World War II ended?
Yes.
What was VJ Day like in St. Louis when the war was over? What was that day like?
Well, I'm going to tell you this. I didn't stay downtown when I knew it was over because I got out. The streets were just packed. You couldn't walk. It was just screaming and hollering and flag waving and confetti coming down out of windows, and it was just something chaotic.
Yeah.
But it was wonderful. It thrilled you inside to know that people were one. Because during the war, while I was going to Small Arms every day, I'd have to stand up and hold on to a strap in the streetcars and buses. You'd hear people say, well, boy, if this war will just stay on now and hang on another couple of years, I'm going to be rich. I'm making so much, and oh, you just wanted to take them and shake them. Isn't that awful? to think of their own self and what they could get out of it to keep the war going. A lot of people felt that way. If it'll just hang on now a little longer, I'm going to make a little. I was looking forward to the day that it was over.
Yeah.
I had brothers over there in the war that I knew they were going through terrible things in Australia and around those islands. But I just would love to be able to talk to the young people today to let them know that they're angry now because they have to pay in a little more money for the Social Security people, and yet if they only knew that before we had Social Security, the children had to care for their own parents and keep them in their home and take care of them and feed them until the day they died, and that was money. Then they would have known what it was to put out money. And surely they would do that for their parents. Now, I'm not talking about our children. It's more of our grandchildren that are doing. But if they only knew that that's the way it was. There was no getting away from it. You took care of your own mother and father. And today they don't want to do it. Why? They're getting by very reasonable taking care of the old folks today on what they have to put out compared to what they did years ago. Mm-hmm. And the Bible tells us we're supposed to. That's one of the laws. One of the things that God has said is to care for your own. Mm-hmm. I love my children, and they're good to me, and I know they love me, but I would not want to live with them. Yeah. Because I don't want to take away from them. They need to be alone. They're a family to themselves, and I'm another one. I live different than they do. I have a desk in there, and I'm by it all the time, reading, writing, and that. And I write short stories when I can. And
was your husband a preacher here in Oklahoma City?
No. No, he's always been a real estate man.
I'm sorry, your father was a preacher. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Okay.
No, my father died before I came to.
So your husband was in real estate.
Yes.
And he was in real estate in Oklahoma City?
Well, in St. Louis, he was a real estate man. He didn't do much of anything. After he lost the property, he was never the same. He couldn't take it. See, where I was used to not having things and working, and that was just a natural, ordinary thing for me. But when you're born with a silver spoon in your mouth, and you know that you don't have to get out and dig for it, and he just couldn't do it. As long as he had money, why, he was all right. But when he lost it, he couldn't take it. That's why, I guess, in one way, I'm glad that I'm not rich. I'm glad that I'm poor.